The motor car turned into the gravel drive, just as the church bells were finishing their 4 o'clock count, and Vera Holbrook did not look back at the road they had come from. She had learned, somewhere between the ceremony and the reception and the quiet, efficient departure, that looking back served no purpose. The ring on her left hand was new enough to feel foreign. The man sitting beside her, her husband, Mr. Aldous Pemberton, had not spoken since they left the hotel in Concord. He was watching the property come into view through the rain-specked window with an expression she could not read and perhaps did not want to. The house was not what she had expected. She had been told it was a family estate. She had imagined something maintained, something that bore the marks of care. What she saw instead was a 3-story Georgian manor with ivy growing unchecked over the eastern wing, 2 shutters hanging at angles that suggested they had been that way for years, and a kitchen garden so overgrown it had begun to reclaim the stone path that led to the back entrance. Vera did not flinch. She had been the bookkeeper for her father's mill in Lowell since she was 19. She knew what neglect looked like in columns, and she knew what it looked like in stone. This house had been ignored for a long time, and it showed in every detail: the gravel unraked, the brass on the front door gone green, the curtains in the upper windows drawn against daylight as though the rooms behind them had simply given up. The motor car stopped. The driver came around to open her door. Aldous stepped out on his side without a word. He stood for a moment on the gravel with his hat in his hands, looking at the house the way a man looks at something he has owed a visit for too long. Then he turned to her. "The housekeeper is Mrs. Pell," he said. "She'll show you the rooms. I have to go back to Boston by 6. Vera looked at him. "Today, there are matters at the firm that can't wait." She wanted to ask him what matters, exactly, required him to leave his wife at an unfamiliar house on the afternoon of their wedding. She did not ask. She had known Aldous Pemberton for 4 months. Their fathers had arranged the match, as such things were still arranged in certain circles in 1908, and she understood already the questions of that kind would be received as accusations. "Of course," she said. She watched the motor car disappear back down the drive. Then she picked up her traveling case and walked to the front door. Mrs. Pell was a compact woman in her 60s, with the careful bearing of someone who had maintained dignity through considerable difficulty. She opened the door before Vera had a chance to knock, which meant she had been watching from the hall window. "Mrs. Pemberton," she said. "Welcome, thank you. I'd like to see the house, if you don't mind." Something shifted in Mrs. Pell's expression, relief perhaps, or the particular kind of wariness that comes from not knowing what a new person will do when they see the truth. "Of course," she said. "I'll show you through." They went room by room. Vera did not say much. She looked at the drawing room with its furniture under Holland covers, the dining room that smelled of damp, the library where 3 of the shelves had collapsed inward, and no one had righted them. She looked at the kitchen, which was clean. Mrs. Pell kept the kitchen clean, that was clear, and at the pantry, which was understocked in a way that suggested the household allowance was not what it should be. "How long has it been like this?" Vera asked. Mrs. Pell folded her hands. "Mr. Pemberton has been in Boston mostly, since his mother passed. That was 3 years ago." "And before that?" "It was a different house." Vera nodded. She went to the window at the end of the upstairs hall and looked out at the kitchen garden. Below, she could see the shape of what had once been orderly beds. Herbs, vegetables, perhaps cutting flowers along the south wall. The bones were still there. The structure had not rotted away. It had only been left alone long enough to fill in with what nature prefers to order. She could work with bones. That first evening, she made a list. She did it at the small writing desk in the bedroom she had been shown. Not the master bedroom, which Mrs. Pell had opened with something like apology, but the room adjacent to it, which had better light. She wrote down everything she had seen, room by room, and beside each item she wrote a number, not a cost, not yet, but a sequence. What had to come first, what could wait, what was merely cosmetic and what was structural. When she finished, she had 4 pages. She read them through twice, made 2 small corrections, and went to sleep. Aldous came back at the end of the following week. He came on a Friday evening and left on Sunday morning, and in that time they had dinner together twice and breakfast once. And he asked her, with apparent sincerity, how she was finding the house. "Interesting," she said. He looked at her over his coffee. He had the kind of face that had probably been handsome at 22, and was still composed at 38. But there was something behind it that she had not been able to name yet. A fatigue that was not physical, a shuttered quality, like the rooms in the East Wing. "I hope Mrs. Pell has been of help." "She has. I'd like to speak to you about the household accounts when you have time." A pause. "Is there a problem?" I'd like to understand the current arrangement before I could say. He said he would make time. He did not make time before Sunday morning. She did not press. But she had already found the ledgers. There were 2 sets of them, which was the first thing she noticed. The household ledger was kept in the kitchen, in Mrs. Pell's careful hand. A record of what was spent, week by week, on coal and food and the 2 remaining staff. And in the library, behind the collapsed shelves she had righted herself on Thursday afternoon, there was a second ledger, older, covering the estate accounts from 1901 to 1905, before the newer ones began. The newer ones were kept by a firm called Barton & Lyle, out of Boston. Their invoices came monthly, tucked into a leather folder on Aldous's desk. A management fee, itemized across several line items, for the oversight of the Pemberton estate. Vera sat at the desk with the invoice folder open in her lap, and did the arithmetic she had learned to do, before she was old enough to have a reason to mistrust it. The fees that Barton & Lyle were charging for the management of this estate were not consistent with a property that had received any meaningful management. The coal prices they had logged for 1906 were 30% above the actual supplier rate for that year. She had a reference catalog from the library in Lowell, and she knew what coal had cost in 1906. The maintenance charges were for work that, based on the state of the property, had either not been done or had been done very poorly, and then invoiced handsomely. And the management fee itself, a flat quarterly sum, had increased by 22% over 4 years, with no notation of any reason. She sat with this for a long time. She was not angry. She was something more measured than anger, something colder and more useful. She had seen her father's mill accounts falsified once by a purchasing agent who had been with the family for 11 years. That situation had been resolved quietly, as these things were when handled correctly, and the purchasing agent had not worked in Lowell again. What Vera had learned from that episode was that the numbers always told the truth. People lied. Numbers were only ever mistaken, and mistakes followed patterns. She began a new ledger that afternoon, her own. She documented everything, the current state of each room against the maintenance charges on record, the fuel expenditures against the actual supplier rates she could verify, the management fees against the work she could find evidence of. She did it methodically, without haste, the way she had learned to do everything that mattered. The kitchen garden she started on a Tuesday. She did not announce it. She simply went out after breakfast in the clothes she used for practical work and began clearing the nearest bed. Samuel, the groundskeeper, an elderly man who seemed genuinely startled to be asked for an opinion, stood at the edge of the path and watched her for a few minutes. "The frost won't be done until April," he said. "I know. I'm not planting, I'm clearing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the second spade that was leaning against the garden wall and started on the adjacent bed without being asked. They worked together 2 hours before he spoke again. "Used to be something, this garden," he said, "when Mr. Pemberton's mother had it." "I can see what it was," Vera said. "The structure is still good." He looked at her sidelong. He was the sort of man who did not offer much, but when he did it was worth having. "You know gardens?" "I know systems," she said. "A garden is just a system that grows." He turned that over and went back to work. By the end of the week, she had cleared 4 beds. By the end of the month, she had all 12. Aldous came back in March with a colleague from the firm, a man named Mr. Fenwick, who seemed surprised to find the house in better order than he had apparently expected. Vera served them dinner in the dining room, which she had aired out and refurnished from what had been stored in the attic. And she listened to them talk about a legal matter. She was not given the full details of, and she noted that Aldous glanced at her twice during the meal, with something that was not his usual composed distance. She did not know what the look was. She filed it away. After dinner, when Mr. Fenwick had retired and they were briefly alone, Aldous said, "You've done a great deal with the house." "It wasn't difficult," she said. "It only needed attention. I didn't expect." He stopped. She waited. "You've made it livable," he said finally. "I didn't realize how far it had gone." She thought about telling him then, about the ledgers, about Barton and Lyle, about what she had found. She looked at his face and judged that he was not ready to hear it. Not because he was weak, but because he was still standing at a distance from the house, from everything the house meant, that she had not yet understood. "I'd still like to talk about the accounts," she said. "When you're ready." He nodded. He left the next morning. She kept working. In April, she drove herself to Boston. She had learned to drive at 19, which had scandalized her mother and delighted her father, and she used the skill without apology. She went to the Public Records Office and pulled the property tax filings for the Pemberton estate for the past 6 years. She went to 3 different fuel and supply companies and asked, as a prospective new customer, about their current rates and their historical pricing structures. She was polite and specific, and she left each place with the information she needed. Then she went to the building on Boylston Street where Barton and Lyle maintained their office. She did not go inside. She stood on the pavement across the street and looked at the building for a few minutes, establishing the kind of general impression that precedes specific knowledge. The office was on the 2nd floor. The name was painted on the window in gold letters. It was not a large operation. She noted that the firm shared its floor with a law office, and that the law office's name she recognized from the leather folder on Aldous's desk. She noted this without surprise and drove home. When she spread her documentation on the dining room table that evening, she had enough. Not enough to be certain. She was always precise about the difference between enough to act and enough to be certain. But enough to know that what was happening with the Pemberton estate accounts was not error. It was sustained, methodical, and it had been going on for at least 5 years. Barton and Lyle was charging for work that was not being done, inflating material costs against rates that could be verified, and collecting a management fee that served no documented function. The connection to the law office, Aldous's own attorneys, suggested the arrangement had been facilitated rather than stumbled into. Someone had set this up deliberately. The question was whether Aldous knew. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about the way he had stood on the gravel drive on their wedding day, hat in his hands, looking at the house like a debt. She thought about the fatigue behind his face that was not physical. She thought about the fact that the estate had been left to deteriorate not through cruelty, but through the specific kind of avoidance that happens when a person cannot look directly at something. She did not believe he knew. She believed he had signed things he had not read, because reading them would have required him to look at the house, and looking at the house would have required him to look at everything that had happened in it. His mother's illness, her death, the years before the marriage that he had never once mentioned. This changed what she needed to do, but not whether she needed to do it. She wrote a letter to her father in Lowell, not asking for help. She was precise about that too, but informing him of the general contours of a financial irregularity she had discovered, and asking whether he still had the contact information for the attorney who had handled the purchasing agent matter at the mill. She wrote it clearly, without drama. She sealed it and posted it herself. She also wrote a summary of her findings in her new ledger, dated and signed in her own hand, and made a copy which she kept in a separate location. Then she went out to the kitchen garden, because the peonies she had planted along the south wall 3 weeks ago needed checking, and the work steadied her. Aldous came in May with no warning. She heard the motor car on the gravel at 2:30 on a Wednesday, and came in from the garden with dirt on her gloves, to find him standing in the hallway, his coat still on, looking at the house the way someone looks at a place they have misremembered. The entrance hall had flowers on the side table. She had cut them herself. The floor was clean. The light was different, because she had had the heavy drapes in the front rooms replaced with something lighter, and the afternoon sun came in now the way it probably hadn't in years. He stood there for a moment without speaking. "You weren't expected until the weekend," she said. "I know. There were things I needed to think about." He looked at her gloves, then at her face. "You've been in the garden. The peonies needed attention." He followed her to the kitchen, where she washed her hands. Mrs. Pell had the good sense to leave them to it, disappearing toward the pantry with a professional efficiency that Vera had come to appreciate. "I've been in contact with Hargrove," Aldous said. Hargrove was his attorney, the one whose name appeared on the office door across the hall from Barton and Lyle. "He tells me you've been making inquiries about the estate accounts." So Hargrove had noticed. Of course he had. She dried her hands and turned around. "I have Vera." He said her name carefully, the way people say things they have rehearsed. "The estate accounts are complex. There are arrangements in place that—" "Aldous," she said his name the same way, "I need to show you something." She took him to the dining room. The ledger was already on the table. She had left it there as though it were any other document, because she had learned that the presentation of information mattered as much as the information itself. She walked him through it. She showed him the Barton and Lyle invoices against the maintenance record she had compiled. She showed him the fuel costs against the verified supplier rates. She showed him the management fee increases against any documentation that might justify them. She did not editorialize. She let the numbers speak, because they were better at it than she was. Aldous sat down. He looked at the ledger for a long time. She watched him read the same column twice, then a third time, She watched the thing behind his face shift, the careful composure loosening, not into anger but into something closer to what it had been hiding. "How long?" he said. "At minimum, 5 years. Possibly from when your mother's estate transferred and Hargrove. The law office shares a floor with Barton and Lyle. I can't tell you more than that from what I have, but I think you should have independent counsel look at this before you speak to him again." He was quiet. She sat down across from him. She had not planned to do that. She had planned to stand, to keep the presentation professional, but sitting felt right. It felt like a different kind of conversation than the one she had been having with him for 5 months. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't." He looked at her. There was something in his face she genuinely had not seen there before, not the composed distance, not the careful management, but something more exposed and, she thought, more real. "You've been here 3 months," he said. "Yes, and you found this." "I had time," she said. "And I know how to read accounts." He looked back at the ledger. "I signed everything Hargrove sent me. For years." He said it quietly, without self-pity, in the way of a man stating a fact about himself he finds difficult to accept. "You were managing a grief," she said. "People do." He looked at her quickly, as if he hadn't expected that. She hadn't quite expected to say it either. But it was true, and she had learned that the truth, stated plainly and without cruelty, was usually more useful than the comfortable silence. The matter took 4 months to resolve. Vera's father's attorney recommended a Boston firm with no connection to Hargrove, and the new attorneys were thorough and methodical in a way that satisfied her. She sat in on 3 of the 4 meetings, which was not standard practice, and which the attorneys adjusted to without complaint. Once they understood she had compiled the primary documentation. Hargrove resigned his position as the Pemberton family attorney in July. Barton and Lyle's contract was terminated in June, following a formal audit that confirmed irregularities across 6 years of billing. There was a settlement, the terms of which were not discussed in her presence, though Aldous told her the broad outline afterward. And it was handled, as her father's matter had been, quietly. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular satisfaction of a problem correctly identified and properly resolved, which was its own thing and better than triumph, because it lasted longer. In August, Aldous came home and did not go back. He said this simply, over dinner one evening, that he was going to work from the estate, at least for a time. Because there were things he had been putting off, and he thought it was time to stop putting them off. He said it looking at the dining room table, which was set properly now, with the candles she had found in the attic and cleaned, and the centerpiece of late summer flowers from the south wall. "The peonies did well," he said. "They did. They needed a good first season to establish." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother planted those." She had not known that. She looked at the flowers in the center of the table, deep rose, fully open, and understood then why he had looked at the garden from the motorcar on their wedding day, with that particular expression. "She had a good eye," Vera said. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it simply, without decoration, and she believed him. In September, Aldous asked her to walk with him through the estate. All of it, not just the house. They walked the grounds with Samuel, who showed them where the fence along the north field had been repaired over the summer, where the old greenhouse frames still stood and could be restored if they wanted, where the kitchen garden's drainage would need addressing before the spring plantings if they wanted to expand it. Aldous asked questions. Good ones, practical ones. He listened to the answers. On the far side of the orchard, where the trees were old enough to have been planted by someone who was no longer alive to see them bear fruit, he stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for leaving you here the way I did. On that first day." She thought about what to say. She had thought about that day many times, not with bitterness but with the same careful attention she gave to anything she wanted to understand. "I think you left me here because you couldn't stay," she said. "And I think you came back because it became somewhere you could." He looked at her. The afternoon light came through the orchard in the way it does in September, long and specific, and she could see him more clearly than she had been able to in 5 months of sitting across from him at dinner. "That's more generous than I deserve," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "I'm usually more interested in accuracy than in generosity." Something happened in his face then. Not the breaking of composure, exactly, more like the composure becoming unnecessary. Like a door that had been held shut by effort, simply easing open because the pressure on the other side was no longer there. He put out his hand, not to shake it in the formal way, but simply to offer it, palm up, the way you offer something to someone you are not sure will take it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she placed her hand in his. They stood there in the orchard in the September light, and around them the old trees were doing what old trees do, standing, holding, bearing, and the house was visible through the branches. Its shutters straight now, its brass cleaned, its east wing no longer hidden behind unchecked ivy. It was not the marriage she had imagined at 19, or at 22, or at any point before her father had come to her with the Pemberton proposal and asked, with the particular gentleness of a man who knew he was asking a great deal, what she thought. She had thought it was workable. She had thought that she was practical enough, and competent enough, and patient enough, to make something of a situation that offered nothing obvious to begin with. She had been right about all of that. But she had not anticipated this, standing in an orchard in September with her hand in a man's hand who had finally come back to himself, feeling the specific, quiet weight of something she did not yet have a name for, and was not in a hurry to name. Some things were better allowed to grow in their own time, in their own way, in the season they chose. She knew that now. The garden had taught her.